Thanks, Ken Corla. Taoiseach, I sat in your office in 2016 following the general election as you were making your first attempt to ascend to the position you now hold. And we talked at some length about the privatisation within healthcare. I remember you used the private Bon Secours in Cork as an example of private healthcare's over-reliance on the public system and the public purse to prop up their operations. You told me you were committed to a public provision of healthcare. Maybe like a former Labour leader said, isn't that what you do during an election? Because your actions today speak volumes that your words to me on that day were not what you believed. The spin machine has been working overtime this morning, Taoiseach. You're quoted as saying, there's no doubt that all guarantees are there. Minister Donnelly has said there will never be any religious influence on the services. The Minister for Justice said she is confident that the hospital will be secular. And Minister Gorman says the last 2 weeks have provided absolute clarity on the secular status of the new hospital. But the women of Ireland know that talk is cheap, particularly from yourselves, Fine Gael and the Greens. Over the course of the hearings held over the last 2 weeks, where I must say a number of questions I tabled to the Minister last Thursday remain unanswered, despite the Minister's promise to me that the answers would be forthcoming. The recurring issue was the unexplained term that appears like a rash throughout the various contracts and licences and constitutions and leases and fact sheets and option agreements, clinically appropriate. Minister Donnelly's initial explanation of its need to be there to prevent St Vincent's from turning the place into a drive-through McDonald's or the likes holds no water, and there has been no better explanation put forward since. The National Maternity Hospital, Holles Street, didn't put it there. St Vincent's Hospital, Holdings, or whatever you're having yourself, say they didn't put it there. The representatives put forward by those organisations at the committee last week say they are happy to see it removed, yet it is still there. Why? It would go a long way to removing the ambiguity that the spider's web of corporate structures has created. It doesn't need clarified, it needs to be removed. My question is this, Taoiseach. We all agree that the hospital should be a public hospital on public land. Sure, your government even supported Joan Collins' private member's motion in that regard. Yet as you appear to be hell-bent on ploughing on with a second-rate option, will your government commit to the removal of the term clinically appropriate from all documentation in relation to the development of the new maternity hospital? That is within your control, Taoiseach, and it emanated from a government department as well.
Taoiseach. In terms of your comments and the remarks through the Chair, on ownership again, I have to be very strong because this debate is focused on the nature of leasehold versus freehold ownership. Leasehold ownership is very common across the state. It's not some new concept. It's generally said, it's clarified that leasehold ownership is common. You talked about state ownership and you said that I had no commitment to state ownership. So through the Chair, if I may, but I know I'm going to come back to your question. I have 3 minutes. But I am entitled to refer to points that you made in terms of the ownership question. This is a publicly owned hospital, that's the point. So I'm not going to allow people to come up and say it's not a publicly, that it's somehow a private agenda. It's anything but a privatised agenda. It's a publicly owned hospital. And I do believe in the way health is evolving that there will be more of this. But health has evolved over the last 100 years through different methods, in all countries, by the way, in terms of voluntary ownerships, in terms of voluntary non-religious. You take James's and other hospitals like that, they have their own sort of independent governance mechanisms. We have voluntary hospitals like Vincent's. So we have to deal with where we are and move on, and the co-location was the origins of this, and so forth. And in terms of the issues in relation to lawfully and legally permissible, all of the legal documentation is there. All of the guarantees are there in terms of legally permissible and lawfully permissible services. And yes, the HSE did put in the clinically appropriate, not the other interests, but the HSE did, to protect the maternity hospital and to ensure that it would be maternity facilities and services and gynae and all the full range of clinically appropriate activity that happens in maternity hospital, as opposed to other uses being made of the maternity hospital or facilities within the maternity hospital. And the lease is clear on that as well, that it has to be used as a maternity hospital. I think there have been attempts made to sort of conjure up an idea that somehow this is that there's some conspiracy behind the utilisation of that language. There simply isn't. And stating there is doesn't make that the reality. There just simply isn't. And time will prove this. Time will prove this. And already, again, if you don't take, as I said, the clinicians are very clear about this in Holles Street. They provide all legally permissible services now, from termination right through. And there's no issue in the hospital at the moment, and there will be no issue in terms of the new hospital either. I mean, that is the reality. And this has been debated now for, as I say, 7 years, 9 years. It doesn't need to be brought to a conclusion. There are 3 contracting parties to it, HSE representing the state, St Vincent's Holdings, and the National Maternity Hospital. There has to be a partnership arrangement, by the way, on this site, because it's a very expansive medical and hospital campus, and that's the objective. The rationale is a bona fide and noble one, actually.
Please, Deputy Pringle.
Taoiseach, the problem is that clinically appropriate is not accepted, and nobody knows really what it means. And you've had to do loads of convoluted explanations today as to what it is to actually try and get it over the line. And the question is, why are you so hung up on it? When everybody agrees that if those 2 words were removed from the lease, it actually would be acceptable. And indeed, even in the Health Committee last Thursday evening, Professor Peter Boylan and Simon McGarr, who were there objecting to this lease, actually said that as a best case, if those words were removed, it would be reasonably acceptable, it would be an acceptable lease. So why are you still hanging on it? I think that's the question that has to be asked and has to be answered. Unfortunately, you're not going to answer it, or seem not to answer it anyway. So the question is, remove those 2 words and the problem would solve, the problem would go away. But you're not willing to do it. Why? That's the question.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Well, through the Chair, I have to say to the Deputy, if that was the case, I mean, for the last 2 weeks I've been arguing about ownership. And now you're saying to me last night that all disappeared? No, but that's what you've just said. You've just said that now, I mean, which kind of... No, but I'm saying over the last fortnight, for the first week or 10 days of this debate, from all sides and the opposition, it was all about ownership. So in other words, this keeps shifting and goalposts keep changing. There's an element of that too, which we have to, but what we must do is address the real concerns that people have in terms of what can happen in the hospital, what services can be permitted. And we received very strong legal advice, the strongest of legal advice government did, that the legal guarantees that all services which are lawful in the state not only will be, but have to be permitted. The directors of the hospital are obliged to ensure the provision of all legally permissible services. That's the point. Like, the legal guarantees have been given and do address all of the issues that were